NJ Audubon now for about a year and a half. And a little bit about me, I grew up on a sheep and tree farm in Lebanon Township in Hunterdon County. And I've been working in wildlife conservation, particularly on private lands for the past 15 years. So I've got a lot of really great information to share with you today. So let's go ahead and get started. So I'm hoping that you will walk away today with a basic understanding of grassland conservation and also some things that you can do on your own property to support grassland birds and other species. I'm just going to start with some basics like defining what a grassland is and explaining, the special group of birds that live in this type of habitat. I'm then going to spend some time describing and giving some examples of best management practices that benefit grassland biodiversity, particularly grassland birds. And then I'll close out with a presentation on just some basic information on resources and technical support. So grasslands can be found on almost every major continent on Earth. They're commonly referred to as prairies, meadows, savannas, early successional habitat, plains, and fields. Grasslands are the most threatened but least protected biome on the planet. And this is because they're easily converted to other forms of land use or development, or in some cases, tree succession in the form of afforestation. And this is a problem because they support a significant part of our agriculture, which is livestock production. Harvested grass is also used for a variety of other purposes, like different agricultural products, such as mulch, biofuel, and compost. Grasslands are also an under-recognized carbon sink. There's a lot of attention and conversation paid to the carbon sequestration of forests, but worldwide, grasslands store about a third of all global terrestrial carbon stocks. And lastly, the biodiversity that exists in grassland habitats is important to our livelihood because nature is essential to human life. However, only like a third of North American species considered endangered are found on grasslands. So supporting these species is really paramount. As a guild, so grassland birds are declining faster than any other group of birds, and the numbers are pretty staggering. The Smithsonian came out with a report a couple years ago that really highlighted some of the precipitous declines that are faced by grassland birds. So about 3/4 of all grassland bird species have experienced pretty significant declines in their populations, meaning that there's almost no grassland bird that has not have had a major impact over the last 50 years by habitat loss and degradation. And those are the leading causes of decline of these species. And, just to put it into a little bit of perspective, about 360 million acres of grassland has been lost from North America. And so this means that in order to support grassland birds, not just grassland birds, but also pollinators, reptiles, and amphibians, mammals, of course, too, that rely on grassland habitat, we need to acknowledge that agricultural lands act as surrogate habitat for these species and therefore manage and do what we can to support them on those lands. Private lands, especially in the East, hold the key to a lot of these species' survival. 61% of the US is in private hands, which is a really magnificent conservation opportunity. So not only do we have the ability to kind of move the needle and bring species back from the brink of extinction, but by supporting nature on our farms, we can make our agriculture both more productive and our land healthier in the process. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. I thought I'd just take a moment to briefly define what a grassland is. So grasslands are one of the largest biomes, which means a landscape that contains, plants, animals, soil characteristics, climate, etc. on the planet. So they take up, a large portion of our landscape. And simply put, grasslands are kind of just these open, continuous areas of land with few to no trees and dominated by grasses. So that grass component is obviously really, really critical to that definition. And there are different variations of grasslands. They can be either natural or man-made. So on the East Coast where we live, our historic landscape did contain savannas and grasslands. So, there's a lot of research that's been coming to light in recent years that suggests that it was not just one continuous swath of forest, that we did in fact have grasslands and savannas that naturally existed. But less than 10% of our historic grasslands remain in the East. Just talking a little bit more about grasslands and defining what that means in terms of a vegetation community. I'm going to be talking a lot today about cool season grasses and warm season grasses and kind of highlighting the difference between those two different vegetation types in a grassland community. So I'm just going to define what those mean exactly. So those terms basically refer to how grasses photosynthesize. And it's an easy way for us to kind of categorize grasses in terms of, what sort of grassland or vegetation type exists. And it also helps us sort of differentiate between the times of year that these grasses are actively growing. So, for example, cool season grasses that are found in grasslands and ag fields in our area are typically turf grasses. These are mainly like having, European origins, your tall fescue, orchard grass, things like that. It is a generalization because there are native cool season grasses like sedges that occur, but for today, we're really mainly talking about the cool season European turf grasses. Warm season grasses, on the flip side, are predominantly native and they grow at the height of summer. So they also, their structure is different from our kind of cool season turf, which are predominantly uniform, and that native grasses kind of grow in this sort of bunch-like kind of clusters. Here. So this is a kind of a classic hayfield that you might find in northern New Jersey. I think I actually took this picture in Clinton. I mentioned this a little bit before on the last slide, but, fields like this are going to be predominantly tall fescue, orchard grass, Kentucky bluegrass, maybe some perennial ryegrass. And these grasses were first introduced, in the 1800s, early 1900s, because they were thought to extend the grazing season for livestock, and they do. However, many historic grasslands with warm season grasses were converted to these cool season pastures, and also forest land, as it was cleared, was also seeded with these species. Cool season grasses are not optimal for wildlife. It doesn't mean that you won't see wildlife using them or even some grassland birds using them. But in terms of biodiversity that exists compared to your native warm season grasslands, it doesn't really come close. So, and this is due to those non-native grasses and their ability to support insect life, which is sort of the backbone for a lot of our food webs in terms of wildlife. So, they're not really providing a diversity of seeds as well for food, and they don't provide the best cover for wildlife. So here in contrast is a warm season grass field. So I think I took this picture like the end of May. So these grasses were still in the process of growing, had not reached full height yet. So you can kind of see how like different times of year you have different grass heights and depending on the species. So there's actually very, very few actual native grassland remnants in New Jersey. So when you're seeing or you've come across one in the landscape, more than likely it's been restored. And these are typically the types of species, grass species that you'll find. So your Indian grass, big blue stem, little blue stem, broom sedge. Historically, though, there probably were a lot more, and you can still see some of those other grasses in the landscape. They're just not commercially available. So also, I want to mention that native grasslands in the East more often than not have a wildflower component. They're not the same as those really like extensive tall grass prairies of the Midwest that don't have a lot of flowers. In New Jersey, wildflowers can be found in our grasslands pretty commonly, and a lot of times there's a really high diversity. I just had a couple of species that I commonly see that I threw up on the slide, but there are considerably more. So just comparing this slide a little bit to the last one too, I'm sure one of the first things you're going to recognize is that there is a greater diversity of plant height and plant structure, different leaf shapes, things like that. And that's what makes native grasses so valuable to wildlife, that there's places to nest and hide from predators. There's just a diversity of plant life that supports a diversity of insect life. I thought I'd be remiss if I didn't at least mention shrublands in this talk too. Shrublands, also referred to as like shrub scrub or early successional habitat, are part of the grassland mosaic, and they do have a grass and wildflower component. However, they also contain some shrubs, even some scattered trees. And there's a very specific suite of birds, your shrublands, shrub scrub birds that use habitat like this. And shrub scrub birds, typically nest either, in the grasses, in the flower areas on the ground, or in the shrubs themselves, depending on the species. Shrublands, can be challenging to manage for a landowner because they're just in a constant state of succession. They're constantly striving to become forest. But they're also pretty common in our landscape, and they often kind of coexist side by side with, hay fields, pasture land and restored grasslands. So I selected some photos of what I thought were fairly identifiable grassland birds for you here. And there's at least 15 species of birds in New Jersey that use some type of grassland or early successional habitat. Arguably, there's even more than that, but these 15 that I have in the photo and over here on the slide are the main ones that I think of when I think of grassland birds in our state. And unfortunately, pretty much all of the birds that I have listed here are either endangered, threatened, or special concern, either on the state or federal level, and because they're experiencing some kind of population decline related to habitat loss. One of the challenges of supporting grassland birds is that there are so many, and they have a diversity of habitat preferences. For example, the eastern meadowlark, which is up in the right corner here, really does well in like these cool season hay fields. That's really where you predominantly see that species, but you won't find an indigo bunting here, which is that really bright blue bird down at the bottom. They're instead going to be using grassland habitat that's closer to even like shrubland or a grassland with a lot of wildflowers. So and additionally, species like the red-winged blackbird up there on top, they're not even considered like true grassland species because they will use multiple habitat types for different parts of their life cycle, but they're frequently used in grassland habitat. So, habitat loss from grassland does impact them. For landowners and farmers that are really into supporting as many different types of grassland birds as possible, the recommendation is to just try and manage for a mosaic of different grassland types across the landscape. So that's really thinking about where you can restore grasslands on your property, putting some, best management practices for livestock grazing in your cool season fields, thinking about managing for some shrubland habitat, and then you'll have that kind of quilt of different habitat types. So, the building blocks of habitat and the availability or the ability of wildlife species to thrive and reproduce is really based on the availability of certain features in the landscape. So grassland birds in particular are limited by space, food availability, and cover, as well as nesting opportunities. So if these features are present on your property, grassland birds will take up residence there. If you build it, they will come. Space is arguably the most significant limiting factor for grassland birds. So, it's estimated, arguably that grassland and shrubland birds need at least 20 acres of contiguous open habitat. and with next to no trees. So that doesn't mean that you have to personally own 20 acres of open land to see grassland birds. Landscape context is extremely important, and grassland birds are very sensitive to changes in the larger landscape. So if your property is small, but it's nestled in an area with a lot of other farms, so there's a lot of open pasture and hay fields, you can still manage for grassland birds on a smaller property footprint, and you will see them on your property because of that connectivity in the landscape. So, when you're starting to think about whether or not your property can support grassland birds, like I said, you're going to really need to look beyond the property lines. And I have an example here. This is actually an Audubon property. So this is one of our sanctuaries. This is the Wattle Stewardship Center in Warren County. This is actually where my office is. Most of our open land is leased to a local farmer for annual crops. And you can kind of see that there in the aerial photo. So, and we have one 11-acre restored grassland field that's right there at the top, and it sits next to like a 4-acre shrubland. However, I never see grassland birds on our site, despite having that restored meadow. And, I will see occasionally some like scrub birds, but I don't see those real like obligate grassland bird species. And this is because we don't have enough contiguous acreage near this field, and it's surrounded by a dense tree line and a lot of forested acreage. I will point out that we found from other projects that Audubon has run that small grains can support grassland bird species if they're adjacent to other grass fields, but corn and soybeans will not. Let's see here. Oh yeah, I wanted to mention real briefly that one way that we're working to improve habitat for birds and other wildlife, and still keeping some of these fields in crops, is by adding a strip of short trees and shrubs and native grasses along the riparian buffer on the Musconetcong River. So these fields are actually adjacent to the Wattles property, and they're owned by New Jersey DEP. We hold a management agreement that allows us to kind of care for this property. So our goal is to add in some of that early successional habitat features in these kind of non-farmable areas to improve habitat for wildlife. And it's not going to bring in grassland birds, but it will enhance biodiversity overall on the site. So as you probably have guessed, grassland birds mainly consume seeds from grasses and flowers as well as insects. Some species will eat fruits, like berries and things, and plant matter, but the predominant food sources are seeds and bugs. Food and energy needs are going to vary for grassland birds by the time of year and also what stage they are in their life stage. For example, fledglings will consume a lot of insects because they need energy for growth, but then overwintering, mature birds will tend to forage on seeds because that's what's available at that time of year. So, and food availability is directly tied to plant diversity. So the majority of insects in grassland systems are herbivores. So without a lot of different kinds of plants, you're not going to have a lot of bugs. And then the grassland birds aren't going to have a lot of food to eat. So this is often where cool season grass fields kind of fall short because those grasses don't support a diversity of insects. Cover is pretty significant, and grassland birds, they need it for a number of scenarios. So they require cover for themselves and their young from aerial predators mainly. Especially during the growing season while the young are, kind of growing and getting accustomed to life, essentially. And they also require protection during the winter months. So many of our grassland birds do migrate south, but not all. So we actually have some winter migrants that hang out with us that come down from northern climates. So considering providing winter habitat in grassland scenarios is important. Warm season grasses have a more rigid structure, as do, of course, a lot of the field flowers. And these grasses are more likely to stay upright during those winter months with snow and wind and ice, as opposed to cool season grasses, which can kind of flop over. So a lot of my upcoming recommendations for best management practices really kind of revolve around providing and protecting nesting habitat during the growing season. Not to say everything I've talked about to this point is not important when it comes to food and space. It certainly is, but it's because nesting cover is a limiting factor for grassland birds that we have the ability to control. Unlike space, we can't really control how much acreage we have, but we can control how and when we manage a field. Nest destruction due to land management is one of the most significant drivers of decline for grassland birds. And the big takeaway message for all this in regards to managing fields is that if you're able to leave some portion of your grassland standing during the nesting season, that's going to go a really long way to protecting these birds. And also briefly, there are a handful of birds that are cavity nesters. So you can put out nest boxes for them. And I've got a slide that I'm going to talk about that in a bit. So I'm sure at this point in the presentation, if you're a landowner, you're starting to think about whether your farm might be able to support grassland birds. I'm sure that, we've got a pretty good diversity of ag producers here today with a lot of different kinds of production systems. And there may be scenarios like the one pictured here in this slide where a lot of your focus and your energy is directed at your commercial crop, rightfully so, whether it's an orchard, vegetable production, et cetera. But perhaps you have a fallow field like the one that's pictured here on the left that's maybe you mow it once a year, maybe you hay it, et cetera, that could be or is being used by birds. So we're going to talk about some steps for setting up some management practices. So the first thing when you're considering grassland habitat management is just see whether you have the right features to support grassland birds. We talked about that earlier. Do you have the space? Is there contiguous habitat? Is the surrounding landscape appropriate? So that's step one. And then the next step is to see, what are you already doing that might be benefiting birds already? So many of the best management practices for regenerative agriculture are going to benefit birds. There's a lot of crossover, and a lot of the things I'm going to mention today, you might be like, oh yeah, I already knew about that. I'm already doing it. I didn't realize that also was helpful for grassland birds. And I'm very much in favor of efficiency. So if you're already doing things like, let's just keep it going, it's just another win for grassland birds. If you're not maximizing what's possible, you might want to consider adopting some of these best management practices, maybe even working with like a professional or enrolling in a cost share program to help support your efforts. So I'm going to start with the simplest and most basic best management practice, which is, managing an existing fallow field or like an old ag field. So these recommendations aren't really for fields that are being actively hayed. I have some information for that later on, but this is for areas that have grown up and were probably farmed at some point and maybe aren't anymore, are a mixture of like cool season grasses, some flowers have snuck in, et cetera. And, there could be large areas of your property that you're just mowing regularly as lawn, and maybe you don't need to do that. So for sites like these, the recommendation is to mow a third of the field each year. I like to think, if it's less than 5 acres, that gets a little bit much. So just splitting it in half and mowing a half each year is probably fine. And this is to ensure that some vegetation is left standing during the winter months or basically at all times of the year. Definitely want to manage for any invasive species that might creep in, like autumn olive, multiflora rose. That's really important as well. And, mowing should occur once a year between February 1st and April 1st if grassland birds are your goal. And this allows for that winter habitat to stay upright through the year. You're not mowing during the growing season. You're avoiding nesting season and all those things. You have that window in the late winter, early spring. That's really the best time. If you're mowing multiple times a year, feel free to stop and save yourself some gas. I mean, in these kind of scenarios, you really only need to mow the field once a year to knock back any like woody plant encroachment. So I was mentioning to Sam earlier that I just have one slide about grassland restoration because I'm pretty sure I could do an entire presentation just talking about the steps needed in the process for restoring grasslands. And I should say, restoring a section of your property to native grasses and flowers is the number one best thing you can do for grassland birds. But it requires, a lot of patience, working with a professional, even more patience. It is a step-by-step process that can take 2 to 4 years for your grassland site to really establish. And it also requires that your existing vegetation is completely eradicated, and that in of itself can take a while depending on your methods, so that you can come in and seed the ground like what's pictured here on the slide. Ordering a seed mix can be a little bit tricky if you're not used to working with native seed. It's, different vendors, understanding how much seed to purchase, what plant species, which is why, working with a conservation professional on projects like this is highly recommended. You may also need to rent or borrow equipment, hire a contractor, and think through all these things before you kind of jump in. You also want to plan how you're going to manage your new grassland once it's installed, because grasslands need to be managed to be kept in that early successional state and not succeed into forest. I hope I haven't discouraged anybody from possibly taking on a project like that. It's really an amazing thing to restore a bit of earth, but it is, a complex process. And one good way to start is by maybe trying out some techniques on a smaller area first. This is actually that small inset picture is at my house. I was doing a bit of experimenting myself. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about livestock grazing, because this is really the type of farm system that is most conducive to grassland birds and also can be one of the most impactful. But the good news is that, sustainable grazing practices that benefit cattle and forage health, or if you're already doing that stuff, that's great, because that's also good for the birds. Most of the grazing systems in North America are built, on cool season grasses. We talked about that a little bit. And some grassland birds like the bobolink and eastern meadowlark will readily use cool season fields. So the key to ensure that you're not overgrazing fields, and if you are able to have areas of grass that are at least 6 inches tall, which is optimum both for forage health and for the birds, is to just make sure, you're employing practices that don't overgraze sites. You're monitoring forage height, you're monitoring what your stocking density is, and et cetera. I have some more tips on that. Incorporating warm season grasses for grazing is highly recommended, and that's a really great thing to add into your grazing system. And this would be like a smaller percentage of your overall acreage. I mean, I've seen everything from like 10% of your overall grazable acreage to like 25%. It really depends on your property, your herd, your goals, etc. But warm season grasses, and there's a couple of species that are really excellent forage for cattle, are great to have. They really can help you through the summer slump. And lastly, I can't say enough about stockpiling. That was a practice I saw a lot when I worked in Virginia, and it's a really great way to save on hay costs, and also it'll allow you to kind of set aside a portion of your acreage for birds too. So I've got some recommended grass heights here for grazing, and these heights, as I mentioned earlier, beneficial to both birds as well as forage health, because They do incorporate considerations for not kind of grazing below those growing points of the grass so that your grass and your forage can bounce back. But also they're providing adequate cover for birds. I will mention though that these are minimum heights. So for cool season grasses, really, you don't want to, for grassland bird considerations, like it really shouldn't be below 6 inches. I know I have 3 inches on there, but that's really like below 6 inches, you're not going to see grassland birds in that field. Warm season grasses, you can see like very different. Oh my gosh, it says 112. That should be 12 inches to 15 inches for the minimum grazing height. That's a typo. So it's very different, and that just goes to show how different those grass types are. Where with warm season grasses, you really need to monitor how much you're grazing down and you're not overgrazing. Really should not be below a foot in those fields, essentially. In addition to height, livestock and like the impacts for providing cover for grassland birds, et cetera. Livestock trampling nests can be another source of mortality for grassland birds and can cause issues. So rotational grazing systems can intensify this problem, but grassland birds can do just fine in rotational grazing systems and actually benefit from those if you have an appropriate stocking density. So generally speaking, depends on like what kind of rotational system you have, but 1 to 2 head of cattle per acre for rotation is usually around the sweet spot that you want to get to maintain that good grass height and also not negatively impact grassland birds. Lastly, really quick, because I know I spent a lot of time on livestock stuff here. I just want to point out that this photo is from Duke Farms, and it's one of their cattle pastures, and they've been successfully grazing cattle at low stocking rates in fields with milkweed and other wildflowers without any toxicity issues. So, and I think collectively, we're seeing a greater increase in research that supports having fields with diverse forage, including wildflowers, that does not negatively affect cattle and actually can positively affect them. So I do have one slide in here just to mention about crop systems. Just kind of briefly, they can be maximized to support insects and wildlife as well as some shrub birds. We frequently recommend, restoring kind of hard to farm areas in crop system to warm season grasses and flowers. This can really enhance nearby habitat features as well as improve biodiversity and soil health on the farm in general. Cover cropping is another really great practice that we recommend. And really any activity that promotes beneficial insects is also a win-win. So, IPM and things like that. So check my time, see how I'm doing here. Okay. So I'm sure many of you have seen, bird nest boxes, or perhaps you've got some installed on your property. In New Jersey, the primary species that use nest boxes in grassland systems are the American kestrel, which is a small raptor, and the eastern bluebird. So these species would normally use like hollowed out trees to build nests in. So in the absence of those natural features, you can install boxes and promote these birds. Boxes can be built or purchased online. There's a lot of really easily accessible information about, where to purchase them, correct dimensions and materials, et cetera, et cetera. Placement is key, and that's something I just want to highlight briefly here. So for bluebirds, nest boxes should be mounted about 4 to 6 feet up off the ground, and you don't want to attach them to trees or have them anywhere near like a tree line or near the woods. I've seen recommendations for upwards of like 200 feet apart, but I've seen them work just fine at like 50 feet apart. This picture actually was at a farm. Those are bluebird boxes, and they're probably like 25 feet apart, and they were full of birds. So, use your discretion. American kestrels, on the other hand, like their space. They really, I mean, it's like 5 to 8 acres per box, really, for them. So, and you're really going to want to think about placement, making sure that they're really in like a nice open field surrounded by a lot of just like open habitat. And you'll need to mount them on a pole that's like at least 10 feet off the ground, 10 to 20 feet, something like that. So they like to be real high up. And, I will say kestrels are an amazing pest control bird because they are raptors. So they're actively hunting rodents, they're eating insects, things like that. So they're a great species to support. Same thing with bluebirds. I mean, they are insectivores, so they're eating a lot of insects and things like that. So this is, a good, somewhat easy practice. The nest boxes do require some maintenance, cleaning them out once a year, things like that. But the last best management practice I wanted to cover is haying. So haying is probably, it's a very common practice in New Jersey, but it's probably the most impactful activity in terms for grassland birds. So this is mainly due to the timing of the activity, but also because that hay just, is removing vegetation in its totality from a field, not really leaving much habitat behind. So haying coincides with the height of grassland bird nesting season usually, which grassland bird nesting season runs from like April 1st to August 1st. Delaying haying is the best way to avoid nest mortality, but it can come at a cost to the farmer. So if the hay is being used to feed livestock and it's not being used for something like mulch or compost, the nutritional quality of hay does decrease as the summer goes on. The best recommendation for hay systems that feed livestock is to try to wait, and you're really wanting to help grassland birds, but to try and wait for at least one clutch to fledge. So June, pushing haying into that June timeframe, maybe even early July is what's recommended. This is a really great risk calendar for grassland birds that was produced by the Smithsonian from Northern Virginia. So our grassland birds pretty much on the same timeline. We may be off by like a week or two. But as you can see, that red area from like May 1st to July 1st is the peak breeding season. And mowing or haying during that time is going to result on sites with grassland birds greater than 90% mortality of nestlings. So, when I work with farmers to incorporate grassland bird BMPs into their ag system, I'm always aiming for trying to incorporate a diversity of practices, but, feasibility is also really important as well. So incorporating just like one or two BMPs is a really good place to start, but it has to make sense with your production system. Otherwise, you're just not going to be able to maintain it. But addressing different trouble spots throughout your farm operation will result in these kind of overall increases of biodiversity, soil health, and pest reduction over time. So we have resources for you and support, and you don't have to figure out a lot of this planning and figuring out how the pieces all fit together, by yourself. We are here to help. So in New Jersey, we're lucky in that we have several nonprofit organizations as well as agencies that can provide just technical support for conservation planning or technical support and cost share money to implement some of these conservation practices. You can kind of choose your own adventure. In terms of technical assistance, which means, a professional is coming out to your property, they're talking about your goals, making a plan. New Jersey Audubon, ourselves, North Jersey RC&D, the Xerces Society, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, we all have folks available at no cost to kind of give you some ideas and to build a plan. If you're in South Jersey, you also have Quail Forever at your disposal. So if you're looking for technical assistance and financial incentive. Most of these entities can also help with that. Just to start with, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, for example, has what's called the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program. And basically what that does is they provide you with, materials, supplies. They often have, can provide seed, tree materials for tree plantings, etc. Labor, they have a lot of the equipment, like the seed drills to do, restoration work, etc. And there's no cost. They do have an agreement that you sign for that. But the lion's share of support for cost share incentives, financial incentives, is going to come from the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service, or NRCS. And, whether it's NRCS staff or those partner biologists, that we have one on staff as well as Quail Forever and the Xerces Society, they can help plan your project and also see if you're eligible for any of these cost share programs. Just to make sure I don't go too far. Yeah, I'm running a little behind. I'm going to blow through some of these real quick so we can take some questions. But I'm going to just highlight 3 programs just really quickly here that are offered via NRCS and also the Farm Service Agency. So this first one here, EQIP, is, the program I think that most people are familiar with, especially if you've received federal cost share funding before. Funding for this program comes from the Farm Bill, and there's a lot of different conservation and agricultural practices that you can be reimbursed, and it's not 100% cost share. So you do get reimbursed for your time if you are able to get a contract. It's a cost share up to a certain amount of money, essentially. And, the first step you'll need to do is just reach out to your local USDA service center. If you're in North Jersey, more than likely it's the Hackettstown Service Center. If you're in Hunterdon or Somerset, it's going to be your Frenchtown Service Center. But yeah, I mean, the EQIP program is something that will really help kind of establish some of these restoration practices. Application deadlines are usually once a year. Sometimes there's more. Typically it's in the fall, so we're a little bit of a distance away from, they're accepting applications for 2026 at this point. The Conservation Stewardship Program, or CSP, it's similar to EQIP in that it is a cost-sharing program, and there's a certain level of eligibility that's involved with all of these programs, where you have to work with NRCS and the Farm Service Agency to make sure that you qualify and meet certain standards. CSP is well suited for people that have been through EQIP already, and or they've done restoration work on their own, and they just need some financial support for upkeep, maintenance, and management, etc. So CSP, actually, I think that's right. Pretty sure it's in March, mid-March. Their application deadline is coming up for this year, if you're interested. And last but not least, I have the Conservation Reserve Program, or CRP. This is actually through the Farm Service Agency, but NRCS does manage the contracts for this. So this program is designed mainly for crop producers. And the idea is that it incentivizes farmers to remove environmentally sensitive land out of production. And a lot of times those environmentally sensitive areas, are also kind of like low producing areas of the farm. So it's actually, helps the farmer's bottom line to remove those from production, get some habitat established there, and then you also receive some rental payments to kind of offset the cost. And those contracts are, upwards of 15 years, and there's a couple different types of CRP as well. Okay, I think I blew through that kind of quick, but any questions about that, I'm happy to answer, or NRCS, of course, can always answer that. So I will turn it over to you, Sam, and just see if there's any questions we can answer for folks.
Yeah, thanks, Celia. We do have some questions over in the chat box. So first, is there a map of historic grasslands in New Jersey that can be shared?
Not to my knowledge. And, there are efforts like that that are ongoing in the Southeast. There's some really interesting research happening through, oh gosh, I think it's the Southeast Grassland Institute, SGI. And they're doing some mapping of grasslands in the Southeast. But as far as I know, there is not one for New Jersey, unfortunately.
How many acres should be left unmowed in fields that have nesting grassland birds?
Mm. So it's not necessarily a matter of acreage, because as long as you have at least that minimum threshold of grassland habitat either on your property or in the adjacent areas, and it's not necessarily like setting things aside. It's a balance between continuing to manage those areas so that they don't succeed into trees and forests. So you're always leaving at least some portion available. And the key is that the management is happening during a time of year when the nesting is not happening. So theoretically, during the growing season, all of that field, all those grasses would be at their normal height, and there would not be, anything really going on that would impact the height of the grasses. And that management occurs during the winter months, and then opportunity for those grasses to kind of grow back. So it's really just about, like I said, managing at the right time of year and making sure that you're providing cover.
Not a question, but just a comment from one of the posters. They are saying that Cialis.org is a good resource if interested in managing for bluebirds. So that's
Oh, interesting.
SIALIS.org.
Okay.
And then there's another question. Does anyone know minimum distance there should be between bluebird and kestrel nest boxes? Asking since kestrels may eat bluebirds.
That's fair. Gosh, I don't know. I feel like you probably don't want them. I don't know. I'm just going to make up a number. So I think you do want some distance from them. I mean, however, if you do have kestrels on your property and bluebird boxes, you're probably going to have some sort of predatory behavior, but you certainly don't want them coming after like bluebird fledglings or anything like that. So yeah, I mean, trying to at least keep them out of the same field or same section of the property is probably a good idea.
And how long from hatching to fledgling in general? And is there a way to minimize cattle trampling nests?
That's a great question. So with that fledgling time span, it from nestling to fledgling, it greatly depends on the species. So the different species of grassland birds have different times, but we're talking like a matter of days to matter like weeks between when they're when they hatch and when they fledge. So it's pretty quick. And I don't think I mentioned this earlier either, but most grassland birds will at least have two nest attempts, sometimes more, within a growing season. So a lot of it is just trying to like let them get one nest fledged before you come in and do management and things like that. How do you can't, there's not necessarily like a way to prevent nest trampling. It's just more, and research has shown that cattle and grassland birds can, even during the nesting season, can coexist. And like, mortality is a far less if you have the right number of cattle per acre on your property. And that's really what it's about, is just making sure that like there is a balance. And yeah, so it's just best advice I have.
Have you noticed the nesting season for bobolinks to be extending later into the year? And this person had bobolinks fledging in their hay fields into late July last summer.
They have a very long like nesting period for grassland. Out of all the grassland birds, I think they have the longest, other than bobwhite quail. We don't really have quail up in North Jersey. Yeah, I mean, they are sensitive to temperature changes as well, but just that species in particular, I mean, they'll start nesting in like, I don't even, maybe like late April, and like you'll see it go like all the way through July. So I think that's just kind of, what they're about essentially. So,
Yeah, there's a follow-up comment to that question from a farm in Hopewell, New Jersey, and they had bobolinks fledging early July last year.
mhm. Yeah. Yep. Sounds about right.
And can non-commercial farms, in our case, an NJ DEP historical interpretive farm, apply for any financial incentive programs or access free warm season native grass seed or grassland plants?
Interesting. If the entity that is so yeah, it depends. Like if the entity that has control over the DEP lands is a nonprofit, then like a nonprofit organization, then yes, because New Jersey Audubon, for example, we have management agreements for a lot of different DEP lands, both in northern Jersey and southern Jersey, and we also hold NRCS cost share programs, and we're the ones holding that money. We're doing the work to do the restoration, and it's happening on state lands essentially. So that is a possibility.
Next question, does management of warm season grasslands being harvested in later months have impacts on grassland birds?
Just later months, I didn't say necessarily like what time of year.
Yes, I guess feel free to type in any clar
Yeah.
October, November.
Oh, in November. So the only impacts it would have at that point would be it probably wouldn't leave much overwintering habitat. And there's still, not a ton of research out there in terms of how grassland birds use, fields and things in the winter, in our state. But we do know, I think I mentioned this, that we do have some that actually come down from northern climates, hang out in New Jersey, and are here just in the winter. And we do have some that stick around. So, yeah, that would be like my concern. And if it's one of those things, I've worked with farmers before where, like, if November is the only time or the fall is the only time they really can like manage fields, then try and at least manage a section of the field and try and leave something standing. Otherwise, you might just not have wintering habitat for birds if that's the case.
Okay, great. I think that's all the questions we've got, and we're almost at time. So thanks so much, Celia. This was really informative. And as a reminder to everyone, we will be emailing this out, the recording. So thanks again for joining us today. If you have any follow-up questions, just please feel free to reach out to Celia or NJRCD staff. So thanks, everyone.
Great. Thank you.